Welcome to a war game scenario video where today we're going to analyze a war scenario in very much detail, and this is going to be a two-part series of analyzing combat based on the video of game theory we have. And without further ado, let's get into the video. Now, we have two teams, the red team and the black team. The black team are defending. They're both equivalent in force, and we are excluding air power for now. The idea is that to see ground force and so forth. Now, the red team has an objective mainly to capture the major cities on the west and push forward. They do not put a lot of value in the actual ability of the black team to actually defend, so they are completely neglecting that. But they generally have much more troops than the black team. The black team on the other side, on the other hand, let's assume they are not such idiots and they understand basic concept of game theory. And they will apply the very first concept of game theory and we'll see how that will develop. But as the game progresses, we'll not assume that the red team is retarded, but you'll assume that they will know what they were doing and that the red team will be able to react appropriately or not. And we will see on each side mainly the mistakes and how the battle develops, and how as military analysts we should observe and study battles. And that's the case that we're doing these videos, to examine battles and to teach battles. Now for the black team, and actually for any general out there, if you don't already know, the main objective of a war is to destroy the enemy's force. Land is something you can capture. And as you can see from my videos on generally war scenarios, you know the importance of logistics, organization, firepower, breakthrough ability, and all of these concepts that we discussed prior, we will observe in this video series. Now let's get into the game. Now, here we have a strong allocation of force of the red team on the west, while the black team concentrates here on the south. The idea and the concept of the black team is to push through, okay? And they are using mainly their heavy infantry to dislodge their forces, and the main idea is to pin them down, while their armor, which has the much bigger breakthrough ability, to be able to break in. Then following, the mechanized units will follow the armor and provide support for their flanks as the armor units continuously progress. For those that don't know, mechanized divisions or brigades, whatever you call them, also have some strong armor capabilities. With the slice here, we have motorized divisions, which is more or less likely a motorized infantry. Here, the black team has a reserve force. As you can see in this brown lines are lines of dug-in defenses, and they are quite strong, and their main objective is to encircle and break the enemy's logistics. Now, the red team has strong allocation on the north, but it does have some reserves on the background. In their assumption, since there is a huge fog of war that we should never ignore, as Clausewitz says, you can't really know the enemy's troops. Now, the more troops on the front line, the more you know. But then you have some other issues. The concentration of force. The more force you concentrate on one point, the more casualties you get and the more disorganized you get. You also get the advantage of being able to break through, but if you fail to break through, as we have analyzed in the video of breakthrough in the military science video, then you tend to get way more casualties. And most important concept, attacking rivers, mountains, and especially cities and entrenched positions are probably the worst thing you can do. We assume that part of those forces on both sides do have some river crossing capabilities, but in general they are quite limited to their armored or mechanized units. Now, the initial plan for the black team is to attack from the south, and the idea is to exploit and move and stop the logistics of the enemy in the 3 vital points. That's goal 1, 2, 3 of equivalent value. The attack will first initiate with a diversion of the south here and a diversionary attack here. So the idea is to attract as much attention as possible. The Red Command will observe that while their forces being attacked on the south are not that strong, they will most probably not redirect enough forces to support them, since they do have some small reserve on the back, and they will mainly focus on breaking the enemy's defenses by attacking at 3 vital points on the front line of the independence, the Black Team. While there are cities and the river crossing which are very, very, very hard to break, well, the idea is that if you have enough firepower, then you will eventually break the enemy's lines of defense. And that's the general thought getting into the battle. Now, as we moved after the first phase and we moved to phase 2, the Black Team has managed to break the enemy line as expected. The forces that were defending here got completely overrun due to the mass quantity of forces that they were encountering while they weren't entrenched, and as a result their units got completely decimated. They received some quite casualties on the south, but they managed to retreat to a bit better defensive positions in the city over here, and they are a bit exposed on the south. But the main worry now for the Red Team is this exploitation that is happening. Now, the thing is, the Red Team can't actually know the quantity of that exploitation that has happened. Again, fog of war. Now, before we move a bit more detail into that, let's see, for example, what's happening on the Western Front here. They managed, let's say, to break through into the city, and they started fighting within the city, which is already entrenched. So even if the defendants have much less forces, they are able to delay the attackers in. They managed to break through here, and they're struggling a bit on the northern front. Now, what they don't know is the quantity of forces, of mechanized forces they have here. In their assumption, maybe they didn't know let's say how many forces they have, which is a common thing that happens in war, but especially how many of those forces are mechanized and the quality of those forces. As you can see, the crossed squares here are reinforced infantry, so with more artillery, maybe better troops, like the Soviets had the guard units, or a bit infantry with a bit support of armor, and so forth. So the initial plan of the Red Team after this has happened is to firstly reinforce the position that has broken through in. So the new reserves are coming in from the east with their main goal of moving in support, but they are way too far away and they are basic infantry. Their forces on the south will try to regroup to better defensive positions and maintain the bridgeheads, while at the same time their units will try to hold on their position. Some infantry units will slowly move back to create a barrier, as they will, and then because if you move a lot of units in an open terrain, it's really hard to maintain organization, and especially if they are not mechanized units, it takes forever for them to march. So if those units were already behind here prior to that attack, they could have already reinforced those cities, so those cities wouldn't have been exposed, but currently they are. And at the same time here, they realize that they might get encircled, so they launch an immediate counterattack to allow time for their forces on the front line to move in and reinforce that position and thus cover their flanks. Let's say the high command of the Red Team doesn't believe this is such a serious situation, and they believe they can crush the enemy defendants on the other side, so they continue their assault with their strongest infantry on the north, since through the fog of war, they realize that there are not many defenders here, and as we have said prior, their main focus is to capture this major city. At the same time, they don't move the majority of their actual armor to the reserve, but they initiate them to attack, believing that if they do manage to break through at those 3 points, then the enemy's attack on their flanks will become meaningless, and thus causing their logistics to collapse, ignoring the fundamentals of entrenchment and fog of war. Here, for example, they may not have expected that the enemy will have a second line of defense. I'm going to make another video on analyzing various defensive lines and how to construct those defensive lines. But in this case, we have a second line of defense. So they did break the first line, but they came in counter to a second line of defense. And they are behind them, they are trapped a bit between a hard place and a rock. So their armor units are taking quite severe casualties, while the black team that they penetrated through, their majority of their forces that did break through are not damaged almost at all. Now, the black team will go with their initial plan and try to exploit their position, but they did not expect a motorized unit to encounter here. So they will follow normally with their plan, and at the same time, and that's the importance of use of initiative in war, that if you have an opportunity, always take that opportunity. Since they haven't encountered any units here, they will try to exploit that position and maybe cutting off all of the enemy's forces as well. So their motorized units that their original job was to cover the flanks will then actually move on to the offensive. So the black team is acting more on the aggressive side. Something, for example, on the German School of War. But I'm not saying they are acting basically. And furthermore, the black team will initiate an offensive on the south to complete their third objective, as we mentioned prior. Now let's see how the battle will envelop. We come to a situation like this. They managed to completely break through on the north. They did face resistance here, which is quite problematic for them because it's harder for them to achieve the encirclement here. So, as Moltke said, once combat is engaged, all battle plans collapsed. The red team has started to receive more mechanized reinforcements, while the black team is just receiving very basic infantry reinforcements. As we have said, the red team has much more troops. Now, their attack on the south, due to their limitation of the force, was not able to exploit their position to push through, and their units on the other side are not in a position to exploit and move. But what we haven't talked a bit, they started moving their infantry, the black team, to better positions to cover the city as well as reinforce their offensive. So here these units are kind of sitting idle, not knowing what's truly happening, and that's the importance of holding a reserve. They managed the black team to reinforce the city here, and while the red team has managed to even break the second line of defense, they are entering into a phase of city combat where armor now starts to receive very heavy casualties. As you can see here, there's a huge concentration of infantry. While on the north, the black team has retreated behind the river and thus avoiding taking huge casualties and using the river as a natural barrier, and thus being able to concentrate more troops on the breakthrough that has encountered on the south. Also, they have used their motorized units to reinforce that breakthrough and thus put a stranglehold on the enemy's armor. At the same time, they managed to encircle their units on the red team's units on the south, and they have quite a strong position, capturing the third objective and moving towards the first and the second objective. Now, again, let's not forget the fog of war. Fog of war is the key. Now, the red team has managed to relocate quite a strong infantry force to protect their actual offensive, and their position is not that in a dangerous position if they actually knew the numbers. And that's the problem that sometimes you have in war with cautiousness. If those units were to immediately launch an offensive, then they could easily overrun or at least delay the armored units. But attacking blindly, it's quite risky in war, especially when you have open terrain and the enemy is holding tanks. Now, the main battle plan of how the black team will react in this case is to completely encircle the city here, create another encirclement here, and completely cut off the forces here, and thus being able eventually to relocate them on the north. Since they have failed to capture significant positions here on the south, the black team will move on to the partial defensive, while they will move some of their mechanized units further to the north to reinforce their initial objectives, and at the same time capture territory if they do not meet any resistance. Again, the extra reinforcements on the western front are just ducked in and waiting to hold the lines of defense. Now let's observe what the red team is doing. Now the red team now will start to occurring some logistical issues, because they had 3 roads of supply, and now the only lifeblood of their army is this line, and that line now is in danger. So all of these units that are actually in combat right now, and every shell they are firing, the reinforcement rate of that shell gets massively decreased. So the combat quality of those forces also get decreased. Furthermore, they start to get demoralized because they don't know what's happening behind the enemy lines. So their plan in this situation is to hold on as long as possible in the positions in the city as to pin down enemy forces that could have been used somewhere else, reinforce defenses here. As for the other team, the black team not to be able to exploit their flanks completely, use their mechanized forces to protect their logistics, protect the city over here with their infantry, again using cautiousness, but if an infantry unit will move to the open and encounter an armored unit, it might be decimated, while the black team will continue again to reinforce that position. Now, the red team now is using cautiousness because their main objective now is to hold on to those positions just to guarantee that their actual original battle plan will not be exploited, believing that at least they can hold on onto this line of defense, and which eventually the black team will run out of steam and new reinforcements will come in. Now moving forward to the next case, the forces of the red team on the south got decimated. They got encircled, but they're pinning down very important troops of the black units, so they cannot be used somewhere else. They managed to gain much bigger ground within the city, and thus getting much closer to their initial objectives. They even managed to break through the second line of defense over here at some parts, but again they are bogged down on the city. But that has come to a great cost, since these units now firepower, organization, and breakthrough ability has massively diminished. And again, not forgetting the fog of war, they don't know that actually the black team has actually very few troops here, and that there are only 2 armored divisions. Scenarios like these are actually not that extreme. Actually, they're not extreme at all. World War II is full of scenarios of a whole division completely going in by itself, and the enemy not counterattacking simply because they don't know how many troops are there. It took the Soviets quite some years to realize the importance of constantly counterattacking just to ensure that there is someone there, and thus break the fog of war. Now, in this situation, now the red team is completely cut off, and they are in quite a hard position. But let's not forget that they are still possessing the majority of the actual troops, and let's say the geopolitical advantage. the black team is massively overextended, and in their mindset, we are assuming they're using a very aggressive focus on the way they fight the war. They don't observe that the enemy is moving in more reinforcements, and they will rush to completely finish their destruction of the red team's forces here on the south, as to be able to relocate forces on the north, destroy the forces in the encirclement, as to be able to use these forces over there, and at the same time start moving their mechanized forces to actually create some barrier. At the same time, the red team now is partially ready to launch a massive counterattack on the forces on the north and regain the ground back, while the armor units that they managed to achieve all of their objective, the main point for them now is a mobile defense. I'm gonna make another video on how mobile defense works, but the main idea is because this is an open terrain, it's very good to use mobile defense in an open terrain. The concept, gist of it, is that you enable the enemy to come through in, and you use your armor to a counterattack while the enemy is attacking. At the same time, they will initiate the red team their attack on the north and try to push in and completely take the city, but at the same time they start to get a bit overextended, and their casualty rates here are quite high. Now, this leads us to a situation that looks like this. The front on the west has almost crumbled for the black team, but they did manage to destroy the enemy's force on the south, and thus they have quite a lot of units to be used to reinforce. But since the majority of these units are infantry based, they will take some time for them to actually move north and reinforce those positions, and the red team is now moving in with quite a lot of troops in, and the black team is starting to have some strong issues. Now, this will be the end of the first part, but before we end, let's analyze the possible scenarios briefly, and we're gonna get them more detailed later on. The idea is that, what's plan B? What do you do in situations like this? Well, practically there is not one answer. There are multiple answers, and there is not one correct answer, because the enemy has multiple answers, and on top of it you have a massive randomness factor. Never forget fog of war. Now, in the next video we're going to analyze the possible scenarios that each side can take from this point onwards, what scenarios they have chosen to take, and how the battle will develop. Of course, this point we're going to act it as a midpoint, and later on I will make more videos that each side will use different type of tactics and different utilities of tactics to approach this problem very differently. Thank you again for watching. Please like and subscribe. If you don't understand many of the concepts we discuss here, please go and check the videos on military science to learn more about the science of war. And thanks again for watching.